In this video, I'm going to talk to you all about sharpening. Now, after all of the sort of wild and crazy and fun things that we've been doing with Photoshop over the last few weeks, sharpening might seem a little, well, I hate to say it, dull. It's definitely a very nuanced and subtle effect, but also very important. It's primarily used when we prepare images for printing, especially for really high quality fine art printing. But it also is a very important final step for all of your images when you're at the very, very end to get them ready for display on the web or any kind of a digital format. So, but it is very subtle. I'm going to show you a few different ways to sharpen and talk to you a little bit about what sharpening actually is and why we do it. I'm going to use for this first example, I'm going to be working on this photo of a really unusual pod from the San Francisco Botanical Garden. And one of the reasons I'm using this image is because it actually is pretty nicely focused. Sharpening isn't a way of fixing images that are out of focus, although you can make some minor adjustments or improvements. It is really about sharpening the naturally soft edges that are part of any digital image. You might not be noticing them, but as we zoom in and we play with them, I think you'll see what I mean. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom in to the center here because we're going to focus on this little area here. And you notice it's interesting because you'll see different layers. This is a very shallow depth of field, but all of these areas in the middle are very sharply focused. And we'll focus on this area for the sharpening, but then we'll move around the photo so you can see all of it. So what is sharpening? Sharpening is basically an illusion that we do to create a little bit more of a sense of a stronger edge or sharpness to the edges of all the areas within an image. And it's an illusion. We're not actually changing the image itself. We're not actually fixing anything, but we are just pushing the pixels together slightly. Now we're ideally, of course, like everything, we're going to do this non-destructively. And because sharpening is always done with filters, we're going to do that by converting this into a smart object. And let me show you a little shortcut. I can just do Control Option or right click and just, oops, that's not the one I want. Let's go back on that. I'm going to convert to a smart object, but it is also a nice shortcut for a clipping mask. Okay, so it's going a little bit slow tonight. Okay, there we go. So we have our little thumbnail and our smart object. I'm going to show you 3 different ways to sharpen tonight, each increasingly more sophisticated. The first one is one of the oldest, I believe it is the oldest sharpening tool in Photoshop, and it is called Unsharp Mask. Now I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but it's basically works by placing a mask over it and well, I'm not going to get into that explanation right now. Now, I've already had been working with this tonight, so it defaulted to that. I'm going to pull it back so you can watch this happen. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and click on this area so that we can see it. And this is a great place to start because we can explain some of the most basic terms that happen in sharpening. So right now I'm zoomed in on this area. I'm going to zoom in. Oop, no, I'm not going to do that. I was going to zoom in a little bit closer, but we really don't need to. We're already zoomed in on the object too, so we can see it in both ways. So we have here amount, radius, and threshold. So the amount is the overall sharpening or contrast because sharpening is essentially contrast. I'm going to bring that up to about 100 just to start. And what you might notice is that absolutely nothing is happening. And that is because this controls the amount of this and this. So we have to have radius and threshold before we'll see an effect. Radius is the primary sharpening tool. It actually increases the radius of sharpness of the number of pixels in depth. And it's really mostly grabbing the edges. And I'm going to start this slowly There you go. And I'm going to keep on going up because I want you to see how, well, kind of terrible it can get. But you can see how we're beginning to really just sharpen, literally make kind of this edge sharpness to the image. Now at a certain point on any image, I'll go ahead and show you the difference. You can definitely see that it's sharpening, but you can also see that we're getting a little bit, it's kind of like clarity, a little bit too much. And with sharpness, you definitely can go too far. Not only does it look just a little bit sort of but it starts to, it will start to actually create a kind of a noise that we call reticulation, where it just starts to jump up in all sorts of crazy areas. So this is probably way too high, but I have it cranked up high so you can see what threshold is. Threshold is actually a way of minimizing the sharpening in the areas in between, in the areas that don't have edges. So this is pushing the areas that have slightly less intense edges. It's going to begin to minimize the sharpening there. So I think you can see that effect right away. That's a pretty high threshold. As we come down, you can see that even though the radius is really still too high, that we're beginning to reduce the sharpening in between. Now it really depends on the image. There is no absolute correct sharpening, but I would say there is such a thing as too much sharpening. So you really kind of tweak all of these back and forth. And what I'm trying to get, and you'll see, I'll compare all of these later, I want to get a really nice separation here. I actually think the threshold on this needs to go down because there's so many little areas that I really want to separate. So there are things, and we're going to look at a portrait in a little bit, there are photo types that you definitely don't want to, you want to get that threshold up, but for this you really want to keep it lower. And I'll pull the amount up just a little bit, and we can do this preview, and you can see hasn't changed the image dramatically, but it just gives this overall sharpness. Okay, actually I think I will pull that back just a little bit. Now of course it's a smart object, so anytime we want to come back and keep on readjusting it, we can. So that is the unsharp mask. I'm zoomed in because really it can be very difficult to really see sharpening. I'll go ahead and zoom all the way out and you'll see what I mean. If I take this sharpening off and put it on, it's not that dramatic from a distance, but it sure makes a difference, especially when printing small detailed areas and to be in an area where people are going to look at it for greater lengths of time. Okay, cool. So that is unsharp mask. Let me go ahead and just throw unsharp mask away. And we will try next Smart Sharpen. This is a slightly newer tool. And we'll come right down here, Smart Sharpen. And it really is, in a sense, it's exactly like come on, we'll see if we can get in here. It's exactly like the unsharp mask. It is the same kind of properties. Sorry, I'm trying to get it to come up here. There we go. But more sophisticated, a lot more options. And again, I'm going to go ahead and zero these out so that I can show you from the beginning. So you can see a lot more sliders here. And one of the things I'll warn you about this particular Smart Sharpen, this particular tool, is that it really takes a lot of memory. So it takes a little bit of time for it to take effect when you get it going. Okay, but let's look at it. We've got the same kind of things up here. We've got the amount. We'll go ahead and bring that up about the same way we did before. We've got radius, and you'll see that kick in. And again, we'll bring it up fairly high because we like that. Whoa. And you can see it is really a very powerful tool, giving us a little bit more. The numbers are not quite exactly corresponding. Bring that back a little bit. Okay. And then this is very important, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit because you can see with this particular filter, we're getting a lot of this reticulation. And the way to take care of this is to go ahead and use the reduce noise filter. And I just take that up about to there. Ooh, maybe a little bit too far. I don't want to soften it too much. This is actually reducing the noise based on the lens blur. This is the natural occurring softness in the lens. Now I can also try it with the Gaussian blur, which has to do more with any kind of blurring that might have happened with the software. Motion blur probably won't do much with this because there is no motion blur in this image yet. So you can see that lens blur is really the best choice here. Again, lots of options here which can be a little bit overwhelming. So we'll go ahead and pull this back so we can look at it again, and that's looking very nice. One thing I like about this filter is it's really separating out all those different little areas. Now these are very interesting, and I want to show you something. So you notice that we don't have threshold, and threshold is that area that suppresses the sharpening over a certain area. I don't want to suppress any sharpening in the highlights here because that's what we're doing here, because really we like all those individual separations there. So I'm going to leave that radius at 0. But I don't really want, let's just, for the sake of argument, I don't really want all the sharpness here. I want the sharpness to focus here. So I could suppress the sharpness in the shadow area. And you'll see the difference when I compare this to the others. So it's really drawing your attention more here, and the shadow areas are less important. Now you'll see what I mean. It takes quite a while to pull this up, and I might have to do a little cooking show magic. And one of the things I'll tell you is about this, when you are using a smart filter and or a smart object, and you put a filter on it and you turn the filter on and off, it actually re-renders the filter, and that's because it's operating on the original object. So it can be a little bit slow and cumbersome. Okay, very nice. This is looking good. I'm not going to take this smart filter off for now. I'm going to show you this in a little bit. I want to go ahead and move on. I have a cooking show version of this later so we can compare it to some of the other filters. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and drag that to the trash, and we'll try this with high pass. High pass is a really interesting filter. Again, a fairly new one. In using with a smart object is the easiest, but there is also a way to use it non-destructively without the smart object. So let's go ahead and grab it. It is in the filter menu, but it's not under Sharpen. It's under Other. And there we go. And high pass is a little odd because as soon as you pull it up, you can see a very simple, not very complicated area, but everything goes completely gray. As you move it to the right, you're going to see this gray come up. Now what's happening is that the areas that are gray are actually operating on the edges, or the areas that are not gray are operating on the edges, and the gray is suppressing the sharpening. And so as you move further and further, the sharpening is going to increase. But of course you can't see that right now. Now, don't worry, we're not going to keep this gray layer on. We're going to leave it about 8.5 pixels. It's kind of a normal sharpening. And I'll show you the real trick to high pass. It's a little bit goofy. We're going to go down here, double click, and this, you might recall, is where the blending modes hide on specialized filter layers. So we're going to take the filter from normal to one of these. We'll start with overlay, and you can see, wow, that's kind of intense. And by the way, we can change the opacity of that blending mode, but for right now I'm going to leave it on the same. Soft light, a little bit subtler. Hard light, very intense. And vivid light, even more intense. Now let's go ahead and just leave it on soft light for now. And I want to show you that once you get that in there, you can actually go back to the high pass filter. And now you can actually see the filter as it is. And so in this case, you can get that direct visual. You can't do it the first time with high pass, but you can the second time. Now you don't have the other controls with high pass, but it actually is quite an effective sharpening tool overall, and it gives you some nice control. It's sort of all in one. It gives you some nice control over the edges. So you can also add high pass without going into the smart filter. I'll show you that. Then we'll do some comparisons and then move on. So let's go ahead and take high pass off of this one. We'll turn this off for now. And we're also going to make this no longer a smart object. So we're going to rasterize it, and that makes it no longer a smart object. And it no longer has our filter. So in order to make this, to use high pass without the smart object, you would simply make a second copy and apply that high pass directly on. And there is this advantage to this. So we're going to go ahead and do high pass. And in this case, I'm going to crank it up fairly high. And then I'm going to do the blend mode directly on the layer. And you can see we'll go ahead and we'll do soft light. And you can see it's a little bit kind of much. So it's acting on this layer. But if we bring the opacity down, you can see that we can begin to get a more subtle effect. So that is yet another way to use the high pass filter. Okay, well, let's go ahead. I'm going to take this layer out. Let's go ahead and compare all of these. And I've prepared a little cooking show magic for you so that we can take a look at each of these versions. So this is, and these are all sharpened to about the same degree so you can see them. Sorry, let me zoom in before we do this. So this is the high pass with the without the smart object, using it as a secondary filter. Take those off. This is high pass with the smart object, and that actually is quite nice. You can see how nicely, what I like about high pass is how it does come in and really separate those areas. And this is with the unsharp mask. That was the very first one we used. Still a nice job. And this is with the smart filter. And it looks like well, no, actually, here's the thing to notice between these two that I think is interesting, is that the unsharp mask sharpens it more, but the smart filters, and again or the smart sharpen, and again I've adjusted each of them a little separately, but it really gets those individual areas. Okay, that's your introduction to sharpening. I hope you're not too overwhelmed. In the next video, I'm going to show you a little bit about how you might use sharpening selectively for portraiture.